Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we are trying to climb to 2300 rapid elo while explaining my thought process as best as I can for your education and entertainment. Just like in the last episode, we have an Alapin Sicilian, and I've recently started playing the Alapin because one, I learned it from Daniel Naroditsky years ago. I've been seeing him play it for a long time, and I figured I quite like the look of it, so I've been trying to learn as much of it as I can. My opponent goes knight f6, which is one of the two main moves against c3, obviously preparing d4 with the support of the c-pawn. However, we can't develop our knight to c3 anymore. So the main moves are knight to f6 and pawn d5. Pawn d5 we saw in the previous episode, so check that out if you're interested. But after knight to f6, we go pawn to e5, and if you were to take these two pawns away, this would kind of be like an Alapin's defense, where the knight gets chased around the center. However, unlike the Alapin's defense, c4 doesn't really make sense because we've already moved the pawn, and we can't follow up with pawn d4 because, of course, Black has very good control over the d4 square. So here we can develop with knight to f3, or we can go for the immediate pawn to d4. And pawn d4 is what I prefer. There are basically two different ways to play this type of position. So after cd4, you can go for the immediate bishop c4, applying pressure to the knight, but I personally prefer knight to f3. And we're not gambiting a pawn because the knight would be hanging, so we have knight to c6 instead. And here we can take on d4, but we can also go for this bishop to c4 move, which is quite interesting, attacking the knight, which personally I quite like. So after bishop c4, knight b6, and bishop back to b3, we would actually be gambiting the c3 pawn, but it is quite dangerous for black to accept the gambit. And I'm not going to pretend like I even know really any of the theory after that. I just know that white has a very strong initiative for the pawn. It's kind of like a Smith-Morra gambit in some ways, by playing d4 against c5 and trying to gambit a pawn on c3. Has a lot of similarities. We also have to be aware of potential bishop takes f7 ideas, which don't work right now, so we're just going to drop the bishop back. But they do work in some cases, particularly because, you know, the e-pawn hasn't moved yet and the d-pawn hasn't moved yet. So, okay, if dc3, we can go knight c3, and after something like d6, I honestly don't know the correct continuation, but I feel like it's an interesting position. I mean, even moves like e6 are kind of interesting, trying to ruin black's pawn structure on the king side. So that is worth noting as well. Although I think we could probably... Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I think we could probably allow him to take. But okay, we have pawn d5. This is an interesting position. So if you watched my match with Pietro Checkmate, then we played two games, one on my channel, one on his channel. In the game on his channel, I played an Alapin Sicilian, and I made the mistake of, in this type of position, taking on d4. And after something like bishop to g4, black goes e6, and just has a very good version of an advanced Caro-Kann. This knight can come from a5 into c4, and it's not very nice to play with the white pieces. So I have come to learn through analysing the game with him that we basically have to take en passant in these positions because we cannot allow black to have this central control. So we have queen takes d6, and okay, we have a decision to make. Do we want to take on d4? Do we want to castle? Do we want to go knight to a3, threatening knight to b5 ideas? I mean, looks interesting. Does look interesting. Let me think. We could even take with the knight. Viable. It's viable. I think there are some positions where bishop e6 is quite an important move for black. I can't remember exactly when, but in some lines it is very important. What happens if we castle and black takes on c3? What happens then? Take, knight takes? Is that good for us? I doubt it, because d5 is coming. So if castles takes, we could play queen e2 and keep the queens on the board. That looks quite interesting. Bishop e6 still exists. We do have rook d1 ideas. Okay. If we take on d4, I probably want to take with the pawn. If bishop g4, I can go, I think, for bishop f7, king f7, knight g5, picking up the bishop. Yeah, I'm not getting overrun in the center with the black pieces. So I can take here without worrying about bishop g4. If bishop to e6, I don't have pawn to d5. If I castle and he takes, I'm not sure. I could go knight c3. I could take myself. Interesting possibilities. I feel like taking is the most principled approach. I guess I have to consider pawn e5, but I guess I just take that. Here, pawn e5. Do I take? Do I push? Knight b4. Knight c3. Pawn e4, knight d4. That looks interesting. That looks interesting. And if I castle and take, I just don't quite see it. If knight a3, I feel like a6 just solves that problem because my knight can't really come to c4 without offering a trade, and I don't want to trade. So I think I'll take back on d4 with the c-pawn. And, okay, I mean, I don't know this position. I don't know the theory, but I feel like this is quite a comfortable position to play with the white pieces. Yes, we have an isolated queen's pawn, which typically isn't a good thing, but we have a very strong bishop on b3, which is nice. We are ready to castle. Black is still a couple moves away from castling, unless he wants to go queenside, which feels suicidal with the open c-file, and the easy tempo coming to a5 with the pawn. And other than that, I mean, our pieces are all ready to come out. We can castle, bring a rook to e1, the knight to c3, the bishop probably to e3, although we'll see what happens with that. This knight is a target on the b6 square. Whenever a knight is on b6, b3, g3, or g6, you should always try and see if you can push a flank pawn to try and dislodge the knight. And, you know, if we were to go a4 and a5 were played to stop us from advancing, well, we can look for knight to c3 and knight to b5, for example, which could be quite annoying to deal with. Also, the knight could be hanging on the b6 square, and if we have a bishop on e3 and play something like d5, maybe we can come with a double threat on the knights. I don't know whether any of those things will happen, but it's a good rule of thumb, which I did learn from Naroditsky, that when it's your opponent's turn, you shouldn't necessarily be calculating concrete lines because, I mean, my opponent could play a variety of things in this position. But instead, it can often be better to try to just consider the themes and general ideas of the position. So that's why I'm talking about, you know, bishop e3 stuff, looking at this knight, pawn a4, pawn a5 could be interesting. Ideas on the f7 pawn, how I want to develop my pieces. I probably want to bring a rook to e1. I'm not sure exactly when or how, but I probably want to go for that sort of thing. And kind of thinking through the general ideas of the position can be really, really useful for that. So great piece of advice from the sensei there, which I've applied in my own games. And yeah, you always have to be aware that bishop g4 just doesn't work in these positions. So my opponent does go bishop to e6, which I believe is the main move. So well played for knowing that. Although, you know, it does make it harder for my opponent to develop his start squared bishop unless he fianchettos it, which he might. So, okay, what happens if we just castle and allow this? Not sure I love that. We could, however, castle and take with the queen, which would give up the d4 pawn, but after takes and queen takes and bishop to e3, or even rook to d1, I feel like we have good enough compensation. I feel like we have good enough compensation there. So I'm actually just going to castle. I'm just going to castle. If he wants to win a pawn, I think I should be okay with it because it is an isolated d-pawn at the end of the day. Like, it could be a weakness later on, particularly if a rook comes to d8 and the bishop fianchettos, and it's kind of reminiscent of a Caro-Kann Panov attack in those ways, where the d-pawn can become massively overloaded by the black pieces, as in, it's just impossible to defend it. And that is a general principle in isolated pawn positions as well, to try to play around the isolated pawn and not necessarily try too hard to grasp onto it with everything you've got. So let's take back with the queen, and we're going to gambit the d4 pawn if my opponent wants it. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're on mobile, if you swipe left in the comments bit just below the video, you can hype the video. Please do if you're on mobile. I'd really appreciate it. It's a new feature YouTube has rolled out. So, yeah, it would mean the world to me. But okay, I think our queen is perfectly placed on the b3 square, to be honest. Eyeing up f7, b7, the knight on b6, sitting just out of the way, but still active. And my opponent does go in for the kill. So, obviously, rook d1 doesn't work with this pin because, I mean, 1, you can just take on f3 with check. But 2, you can just take the queen and then take the rook, and it's not great. So, we will have to be taking this knight. And we're down a pawn. Okay, sure. What's our compensation? Well, we're already castled. Okay, well, that's good. After queen takes, we get to develop with tempo. Okay, that's also good. But do we have enough compensation? I don't know. Let's find out. So if bishop to e3, queen f6 looks very likely. So here, keeping an eye on the knight. And you don't really want to come to d6, because then rook d1 comes with tempo. So if bishop e3, queen f6, and knight c3, for example, looks interesting. We could even start with knight c3, preparing ideas of knight b5 and bishop f4. e5 is going to be hard to play because my rook can come to e1. So I'm actually thinking knight c3 might be the way to go. And you can't play pawn a6 to stop my knight coming in, because then I just skewer and I win the knight. So actually, I think knight to c3 is the way to go. If a move like queen to c4 is played, which could be played, offering me a queen trade, how do I go about that? Probably still knight b5, allowing this trade, because you've got to stop this. But if you go rook to c8, then a7 hangs, and black is playing without half of his army, and I'm playing with every single one of my pieces. So I'm down a pawn, but I think we have enough compensation. And I think these are really difficult concepts for a lot of maybe more beginner and intermediate players to kind of get their head around, where, I've gambited a pawn, so in theory I should be keeping queens on the board. But if something like queen c4 is played, and I play like queen c2, for example, just trying to keep the queens on the board, which generally is good practice, because, you want to be able to attack your opponent, and your queen is typically going to be the best attacker. But it wastes a lot of time, which, do I really have the time to be wasting? Personally, I would argue that I don't. So I'm very much against retreating my queen. And instead, I'd just like to continue the attack with something like knight to b5, just really going for it. So, okay, we'll see what my opponent goes for. Like I said, a6 doesn't work because of bishop e3. So I think that changing the move order with knight c3 first makes a lot of sense, because if black plays something like queen f6, like I'd calculated after bishop to e3, then I get the immediate knight b5. And if rook to c8, I mean, I can probably just take on on a7, to be honest. I win my pawn back. Also, let's not forget that this diagonal could be a bit of a problem for black in some positions. Also, if a7 falls, then this knight is going to be very unstable. But okay, we have queen c4, so knight b5 is the move I wanted to play here. That's what I want. If queen here, I do not play knight c7 first, because after king d8, my knight is under attack, and after I take, I just lose my knight. So knight b5, queen b3, a b3. That's pretty good. If knight b5, my threat is to play take, and give this fork and win the rook. So knight b5, what does black play? If rook c8, Then again, I think I just take on a7. Yeah. Take on a7. That looks good to me. If takes and takes, there is rook back to a8. But then I have bishop e3 defending the rook, attacking the knight. My knight is going to be fine. And black still isn't developed. Let's say something like knight to d5. Knight d5. Knight b5. Rook a1, rook a1. If knight b3, rook a8, king d7, pawn e3, pawn g6, preparing to fianchetto. It's interesting, actually. I still think knight b5 is the way to go, because otherwise, what play do I have, right? Like, that has to be the move. Because if I don't play it now, then my opponent will trade queens and then play pawn a6, keeping my knight out. And then this knight won't be hanging because my queen will be off the board. So I think it's kind of a now or never move. And, you know, maybe I've messed up. Maybe I am just down a pawn. But I think that what gives me a lot of confidence in my idea is the fact that black is struggling to develop his king side. The E pawn and the G pawn haven't moved. So this bishop needs time to get out, which is going to take time. And in that time, can black survive? That's the question. So yeah, rook c8, knight a7 looks pretty simple to me. I just win a pawn. Oh yeah, actually, in that line, even if black does get g6, I have equalized the material. Yeah, so that's actually fine. Okay, so what else can black do? If take and take, then a7 is incredibly weak. Let's say king d8. Bishop f4, threatening this check, and then after takes and takes, the rook would hang. That's quite nice. Even bishop e3 would be fine, just attacking the knight, because if takes, I take. Same idea. Rook d1 is also an idea if the king goes to c8. Also, a7 just hangs. a7 hangs in all of those lines. And I can stop it from moving by playing bishop e3, because then if a6, the knight would hang. So I think we're doing rather well. We are also slightly up on the clock, which is great news, particularly on the Chess Centurion channel, where we normally struggle immensely with the clock situation. Mostly because I'm trying to explain my moves, and, you know, that just takes time to do, which I could be spending thinking under normal circumstances. Okay, rook c8 on the board. Doesn't that just make my life really easy? Just knight a7. Knight a7, rook a8. Well, then I just take this, and that's game over. So you have to trade the queens. So queen b3, a b3. Rook is under attack. So rook a8. Bishop e3 hitting the knight and making sure my rook is defended. Looks pretty easy to me, I'm not going to lie. Looks pretty easy to continue that. So, yeah, I would say I'm very, very happy with this. I'm not sure there's really much more that black could have done in that position. But this is such a common idea in the Alapin to go either knight to a3 or knight to c3, come into b5 and apply a ton of pressure to that c7 square. And in the same vein, as I was mentioning earlier about a4, a5 leaving this knight vulnerable, by winning the a7 pawn, the knight is now vulnerable. Okay, well, doesn't that just lose the game on the spot? I think my opponent missed queen b6. I don't see anything for him now. Yeah, that's just game over. To be fair, that was an easy move to miss. What? Take, knight out. Yeah, why would you offer a queen trade? I don't know. I mean, I would assume my opponent should be resigning right about now, but yeah, bit of an odd decision, I would say. I mean, to be fair though, I mean, what else can black do? If he doesn't do anything, I'm going to go queen b5 check, forcing a queen trade regardless. So I suppose it doesn't really matter. Or I'll take on b7 and trade here, whatever. I don't think it matters that much. So that should be a win, because after he takes, I can escape with the knight via c6. There is no way to trap my knight. I have way too many options to retreat to, and I'm just going to be up a full piece. And I have a 2-on-1 on the queen side, which will make it very, very easy for me to create a passed pawn. So, yeah, kind of resignation impending. I don't see any counterplay for black, or at least any significant counterplay. I mean, if rook c8, knight b5, okay, pawn g6. I think I just go for this, right? Or even this. I mean, I just need to make sure I don't blunder anything silly, basically. But I think bishop e3, knight d4 is an easy setup. Although I guess I should leave the knight here for now, because it is stopping black from castling, because I'll take on e7 with check, which is going to be annoying for him. Is there anything else to consider? I mean, where do I want to put my rooks? I mean, you would assume on c1 and d1. I can also offer a bishop trade, which feels pretty good, right? Feels pretty good. If I can get this bishop trade, then the game effectively ends, because I just put rooks on c1 and d1, and then there's nothing, because those are the only two files that my opponent's rook can use. I mean, even if I didn't have the move bishop to d4 offering a bishop trade, I could always go for something else. Let me think. Yeah, let's go rook c1, because if he goes rook to d8, I mean, one, I could go knight to c6 going for this, but I think easier after rook here would probably just be knight f3 covering d2. Okay, pawn e6. All right. Let's go rook f to d1. If rook to b8, then I assume pawn to b3 is simple enough. Just ensuring the pawn is defended. I should give my king some luft with a move like pawn g3, just to avoid any back rank shenanigans. That would make sense. I just need to make sure my opponent's rooks can't infiltrate my second rank in any way, because that would probably be, well, alongside getting back rank mated, the only real way to lose this position, because there is no reason to be losing this position in all reality. I'm going to play out the rest of the game, and then I'm just going to go over it, because this seems pretty easy. If anything interesting happens, I'll record again, but... Okay, just to catch you up, brought the rooks over, played b3 to ensure b2 is fine. My opponent offered me a rook trade, and I decided to try and get my king to e2 to cut off the infiltration. My opponent traded with me, went rook d8, so I played knight to f3, covering the d2 infiltration. This is very much about limiting my opponent's play. Pawn f6 stopping my knight from coming in. I played king e2 to make sure that the d file is covered. King f7, rook to c7 check, king to e8. I could have grabbed the pawn on h7, threatening a rook trade, but I played rook c6 instead, because I decided that the a6 pawn was more important, because then I have connected passes. Rook c8, I go king to d2 to cover the infiltrations, not king d3, because I didn't want to allow rook to c1. So I went king d2, rook c7, pawn b4 pushing, rook b7, king c3, protecting the pawn. And after rook to c7 check, which my opponent just played. Let me think what I want. Yeah, let's go king to b3 here, just defending the pawn. And I am allowing the rook to the c1 square, but I'm not particularly concerned. I mean, I can go grab the h7 pawn if I really want, although I don't really care about it. But my opponent goes for rook b7, which makes my life easier. We'll just throw our queenside pawns down the board. And this is basically, for me, just an exercise in limiting my opponent's counterplay, which is why I decided to restart the video. Pawn f5 creates a hole, so I'm going to hop my knight into e5 instinctively. I know my knight cannot be attacked by this king because the king cannot pass on to the 6th rank to attack my knight. So after the king goes to e7, we'll go pawn to f4, securing the knight and trying to play against pawn g5. Okay, king f6. We could go h4 to be fair, which I think is quite nice, just stopping g5 ideas. Pawn to h6 would prepare pawn g5. There we go. But after pawn g3, even if pawn g5 is played, we can go takes and takes. And then if you take, I can just take back and I'm perfectly fine. So after all that has been sorted, I can go back to focusing on my queenside pawns. So let's go pawn to b5. Just rolling the pawns further up the board. Takes and takes. My knight is well defended. And, okay, yeah, he goes rook h7, trying to create counterplay on my f4 pawn, which makes a lot of sense. But I think we just keep rolling with pawn b6. The rook really needs to keep an eye. Could go to h1, so that if I push, he has rook to b1, picking up the pawn. But I think if rook to h1, we can probably just go king c4, stepping off of the c file. Sorry, the b file. Yeah, so after rook b7, just pawn a5, preparing rook a7, so that this is defended. The pawn defends the rook defends the b7 square. This is quite a typical sort of setup for getting past pawns down the board with a rook. Okay, rook h7. Actually, let's just bring the king up the board, because my opponent's going to try and give me checks from behind, most likely. So if I can bring my king up the board and play something like knight to c4 to cover my king, or bring the king to c7 and go knight c6 to cover the king, that's probably the easiest approach. And now with rook to h1, I can just push. Okay, we have rook to h4, attacking my f4 pawn. If I push and he takes, then I come here and he can't stop the promotion, so let's just do that. I could also just go knight to d3 defending, but there's not really any need. He can have my knight because I can just promote the pawn, and he has no way of stopping the promotion because my king covers the b4 square. So I can just promote to a queen, give some checks, and eventually deliver a killing blow. And to be fair, the easiest thing is probably just to sack my queen, and then push, and then push, and then promote, and then I'll just win this pawn and deliver some kind of checkmate. That seems the easiest thing to do. I just need to make sure that I don't accidentally stalemate my opponent, but I can probably give some kind of ladder mate to make things easy. So, yeah, I mean, this is game over. Surprised my opponent's played on this long, to be fair, because it didn't really seem like he had any actual counterplay. But, you know, I suppose never resign, but this position is definitely resignable. The f-pawn cannot be defended in any way, and it's unlikely that I'm going to stalemate my opponent. Okay, my opponent goes king to b1. I mean, I can still just take with the queen, because my opponent still has the h2 square to go to. So we have that, and then I'll just give this check. He comes back, and then I deliver checkmate. So I'm not going to pre-move anything, even though I probably can, just because it's bad practice, I think. We don't need to be getting into the habit of making pre-moves that could result in some disastrous stalemate. But rook to h1 is checkmate, and everything comes with check, so we don't have to worry too much. So GG to my opponent, pretty clean win. I wonder what that mistake was. It might have been at some point in the opening, if I had to guess, because after the opening phase, I mean, it felt pretty dominant. But let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay, so 95.1% accuracy for us, 88.1% for my opponent. It looks like, yeah, we have made a mistake somewhere, so let's have a look. We have e4, c5, the Alapin Sicilian with c3, knight to f6, pawn e5, which is the main way to play. As I said in the beginning of the video, d5 is the other way to play for black, which you can check the previous episode of the rating climb if you want to see that. But we have knight f6, pawn e5, knight e5, and pawn d4, which is the main way to play. And after knight to f3, this cannot be taken because the knight hangs, which is an important detail. So knight c6, bishop c4, you can also take on d4, and after something like d6, bishop c4, knight b6, bishop to b5, or bishop b3, the position is very, very similar to what we had in the game. But bishop c4, knight b6, bishop b3, pawn d5, and here, like I said, in the match against Pietro Checkmate, I'm not sure it was this exact position, but it might have been. I took on d4, and after bishop to g4, and I think I went bishop e3, defending d4 because of takes, takes, and takes. Black is just clearly better. This is like a French defense where we have this weak d4 pawn and the vulnerable c4 square, and the light squared bishop is already outside the pawn chain. I don't really have anything great here. I can try some kind of kingside attack, but just g6 should stop everything. So ed6 is the way to play, I now know. So after queen d6, I wasn't exactly sure what I should be doing here. I was considering, well, I mean, I played takes, obviously. Apparently knight takes is slightly better, because it stops bishop to e6, I guess. And after knight takes, pawn takes, bishop e6, we have basically the same position after castles. And if takes, takes, and takes, it's the exact same thing. Okay, that's quite interesting. The exact same thing. But basically, if you take with a knight, it forces that position more so. I also considered castles, but after dc3, I wasn't entirely sure what the plan was. After knight c3, queen d1, rook d1, I wasn't sure where to go from here. Okay, it's interesting though. I also have the possibility of knight to g5, which I considered, but I thought pawn e6, and I couldn't see a follow-up. Here, the only way to play is queen h5. And queen e7 defending, then knight c3. And I guess black's struggling to develop. Pawn g6. Queen h3, bishop g7, knight g to e4. There's a lot of only moves here, I will say. But if something like castles, bishop g5, I guess I win the f6 square, which is quite nice. But okay, I go cd4. I was also considering knight to a3, which is also a move. But after dc3, queen d6, ed6, knight to b5, I wasn't really sure what the plan was after black defends the c7 pawn. Apparently rook b8 is the best move. And then after knight g5, knight e5 defending, castles. It's still quite interesting, to be fair. We're down 2 pawns, but we have very active knights. And if something like h6 is played, knight e4, we threaten d6. And apparently black has to give that up. There's quite an interesting position. But I go cd4. Bishop e6 is the main move. I castle. And after takes and takes, knight d4 is a big mistake. Big mistake, which I kind of thought it was. I mean, it's very risky to take that pawn. E6 would have been safer. But I guess after knight c3, you still have to be concerned about knight b5. Here the engine really wants queen b4, offering a queen trade. And here I would have to try to run away. And then if knight d4, queen d4, we have the same idea of knight b5 with devastating effect. So, okay, take. Okay, here knight c3 is the mistake. Okay, calling it a mistake I think is harsh. It's the second best move. Obviously, we have 3 options. Rook d1, bishop e3, or knight c3. Those are the 3 options. Rook d1 is also playable, but bishop e3 is what the engine wants. I thought queen f6 was going to be played here. Apparently, after knight c3, the game is over. After knight b5. Okay. Oh, yeah, because there's no a6. Because the knight hangs. So the best move is queen a4, which I have to admit I didn't see. But after knight c3, queen b3, a b3, this is clearly toppling. Like, you are at least going to lose a pawn here as black. The best move is rook b8. And I mean, bishop f4 is the best response, but even just rook a7, and I'm clearly better. The knight has to go back to c8, actually. And after something like, let's say, rook to a4, I mean, what? Like, e6 trying to develop, Rook d1, bishop e7. Here the game ends after bishop f4. That's it. There's no blocking, there's no escaping. So it's still rough. So knight c3 is a mistake. Queen c4 is the best move. Knight b5, black is okay here. Apparently bishop e3 is the best move. And if takes and takes, we have the same situation. So knight b5, rook c8, knight a7. So rook a8 is a blunder, obviously. The engine actually thinks black can play this position. After rook d8, if I go bishop e3, then I guess knight d5 is strong. So knight back to b5. Here black has to find pawn f6, running to f7 with the king. And after bishop to e3, if knight to d5, rook f to d1, pawn e6, knight d5, e d5. I still think this is easier to play with the white pieces. Yeah, I still quite like this, to be honest. Rook a5, attacking the pawn. I'm just going to win a pawn if I really want to. Should be a draw because these are doubled pawns. But only if black goes for an endgame, which, again, could be difficult to hold. But okay. Rook a8 my opponent played. I could have played more accurately with the immediate bishop to e3, but after queen b6, this is obviously game over. And I mean, I kind of spoke through this enough during the game, to be honest. Some of the moves won't be perfect, but it doesn't really matter. I'm playing moves to stifle my opponent's counterplay primarily and just deliver a clean win. And pushing the queenside pawns is clearly the best way to do that. I quite liked creating this outpost for my knight on the e5 square because it just limits all, like any and all counterplay is just gone. And once I promote, I mean, that's about it, really. Easy. It's an easy conversion tactic to just sack the queen for the rook. And, yeah, this is just mate in two, obviously. So, really interesting game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to see that other Alapin Sicilian game that I'm talking about with pawn d5 instead of knight to f6 on move 2, then check out this video up here if you're interested. If you want to see the previous episodes of the climb to 2300, please check out the playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.